Hello and welcome to RIVE, Reflections in Veterinary Education. This month is Journal Club, and I've picked an article this month, and I've somewhat selfishly chosen an article that is relevant to my current course for my master's. So I'm taking Gender in Education, which has been like super fascinating, just to kind of talk about the impacts and like throughout the whole semester has been like different topics about the impact of not just gender, but sex, gender, sexuality, all of that, and how that can impact. Obviously, we don't just talk about education, but trying to think about how that impacts, learning. And so one of the things we're doing throughout the semester, each, because this is not veterinary specific, but we each get to choose, something that's relevant to us. And so I'm looking at gender in veterinary education. And so that's my somewhat selfish reason for selecting the article for this month, which is by Katie Freestone and colleagues, and it is in Vet Record. The title is Gender Discrimination of Veterinary Students and Its Impact on Career Aspiration, a Mixed Methods Approach. So I've read for this course a lot more articles, but I thought this could be like a springboard for some of the things that we can discuss on a more broad scale. But I guess I'll pause there for a second, just so I'm not the only one talking, and maybe just get your initial impressions. We can talk about that, and then we can kind of get through like the journal clubby part where we talk about, the article and what's happening. So yeah, what were your initial thoughts on the article choice and kind of the topic in general?
Well, I was actually very interested in the topic. I don't think it's necessarily a new topic, and I don't know that there's necessarily a lot of new things to be said about it. And I think that's probably true of this article as well. But I was glad to see that it is being explored and that it's being published on. I will have to say that I wasn't a huge fan of this particular article for a number of reasons. But again, I was glad to see that it was being explored, and I was glad that you chose it because I think it's something that, we don't talk about because it is a feminized profession for however you want.
Oh, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah. And so there's this idea that, gender discrimination can't possibly exist when, most of the people in the profession are women. And so I think that's a really important thing to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Eric?
I welcomed it. It did occur to me that, this might also be a topic we could talk about, like separate from a paper journal club sort of thing, because I think that I think that we need enough time on this podcast to talk about this as a topic.
That's fair.
Because I think, we'll spend a lot of time on the paper, like Catherine was saying. But it is interesting. I guess I was mostly like the fact that it was UK was like, oh, okay, like that's great. I wish it had been US. That's what I was hoping when I saw the title.
Sure, that's fair. Well, the part of the reason I chose this was also from like a journal club standpoint. Catherine, I think I'm sure we'll talk about some of the things because I had some issues with the article itself from just like a research standpoint, and so I think those are good things to talk about. Maybe that's better if Eric, if you can promise me that we can talk about gender and veterinary medicine in a future episode, then we don't have to go into all of the stuff that I know.
No, I mean, we should definitely tackle it now, but this is more than an hour,
which is fair, which is a super duper fair point. But I thought it would be a good springboard, and like I said, a little bit selfishly because this is something that I'm discussing and writing my final paper for the course on, and so I've got some ideas of this paper being just one of many in gender and education, but specifically in veterinary education, because there are quite a few things that have been written specific to veterinary education, not a ton, but it's not like there was only 3 things I could choose from. But starting off, for this paper, so I don't know where you all stand on mixed methods. I know that some people have very strong opinions about mixed methods in general, but mixed methods meaning there's a qualitative and a quantitative component to the research. I know one of my my qualitative research professor instructor was like not a fan of mixed methods. It was kind of like pick one and stick with it. Maybe coming from like a very quantitative background and like that's what I'm used to. I'm like, but I do like to see kind of where one can sort of inform the other. And I think it can be done well. I don't know that I think it often isn't done very well, which is I think where like my professor was like, not a big fan of mixed methods. You get somebody who's a qualitative researcher and add some quantitative in, and the quantitative isn't very good, or vice versa. And so I think if you have a team of people who are good at both, it has greater potential, or better yet, somebody who has experience with mixed methods. But yeah, what are your initial thoughts on mixed methods, just to get that out of the way?
So I had a professor who came from a very hardcore quantitative psychology PhD background, who ended up being a qualitative researcher and was adamantly against mixed methods research. And she said that it was almost impossible to do a mixed methods research project well, because for those reasons that you just said, Bobby. And oftentimes, and this is probably my bias, but oftentimes what happens is that quantitative researchers sprinkle in qualitative because they think there's something there and they don't think qualitative is that much harder. And it's just easy to kind of add it in, and they do a really basically piss poor job of it. And so she was adamantly against it. I believe that there is value in mixed methods, but it's really hard to do well. And I do think that you have to have somebody who really understands qualitative research and somebody who really understands quantitative research to be able to do it all in one paper. But I also think from a logistical standpoint, it's just really hard because qualitative papers tend to be good ones, tend to be really long already. And then adding in the quantitative piece just makes it even longer. So I'm on the fence about it. I think that you can do it well. I just think it's really, really hard to do. And I would say that this is a good example of why you shouldn't try to do mixed methods research.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that for me, the problem is the research questions that you ask are so rarely better answered with a mixed methods approach. You know, the whole point of quantitative methods is external validity, right? You want to take this data and apply it to different situations. Like, okay, well, I'm reading this study. Can I apply that to my students at Auburn? Like that's the point of quantitative data largely. And qualitative is drilling down, you know, and like getting at the why and like exploring the reasons and that sort of thing. And I just think that there are not a lot of research questions where you want external validity, but also the why to explain that simultaneously, you know. I think that it can be done well in one paper. And I think that for me, where I appreciate it is when you have the quantitative data for like a large data set, it's like, okay, I've got all this stuff and I want to explain it in greater detail. And I think if I can get that qualitative data to explain these findings, for me, that's where I think that fits in nicely.
I like that. I think there's something that you made a comment earlier, Catherine, about in one paper. And I think sometimes, you know, feeling like we need to smush it into one paper, and ask yourself the question, like, maybe this should be two separate papers, you know, and that might be a better approach when you, because like I've definitely had situations where I'm like, well, I need some quantitative data to help inform like what my approach might be for the qualitative research, or vice versa. You know what, we've asked these questions and oh, we've got this really interesting thing. I wonder if this is, you know, applicable more broadly. Now let's maybe look at this on a qualitative, but doing it all at the same time, I think is one, if you're doing it truly like at the same time, maybe isn't always, I'm sure there's times, but like isn't always the best. But saying, hey, we've done this qualitative piece, now we want to see, you know, if does this apply on a larger scale? Like you said, does this apply in multiple situations? Now that we know what questions we want to ask, or, you know, what data we want to collect, or again, vice versa, we're finding some interesting, you know, patterns in this data. Now we can develop our quantitative or excuse me, our qualitative approach to get at that deeper layer. But we often feel like we have to get it all in one paper, and like maybe like from also just like from a publishing standpoint, like if you need to publish a lot of things, like turn that into two papers. Heck yeah, that's great. So
yeah, I'm actually working on a project right now that has a huge database It's not huge quantitatively, but it's big enough to have some validity, but it's huge for a qualitative database because it was a survey that had, you know, sort of quantitative questions that were then also had some open-ended questions. And so I'm helping out with the qualitative side of it. And when the sort of PI came back from the group that he was working with and was like, well, the group's really pushing me to, because I had talked to them about doing 2 separate papers. And he was like, well, the group really wants this all to be in one paper. I'm like, this is not a one paper thing. And so he's like, well, you know, let's work on it a little bit more and then I'll go back. And he's a good quantitative researcher. He's very open to dabbling in the qualitative, which is why I'm still helping them. And about probably 3 or 4 meetings in, he was like, yeah, this needs to be 2 separate papers.
Yeah.
And so he went back and talked to the group and he was like, well, they're giving me pushback. And I basically just said to them, it's going to be 2 papers because it's
Well, and the
Yeah.
problem is, in my opinion, the length is a serious barrier. Like by the
Yeah.
time you describe the methods for each of the things that you're doing, and then give the detail that you need in the results and everything else, like there's just not enough length for
And it's just
often.
confusing. It's
Right.
just, it's
Well-
really hard to keep track of everything.
And nobody wants to read a 60-page paper. I mean, or even a 40-page paper, right? Like, I mean, a lot of the qualitative papers tend to be around 15 to 25 pages already. And then if you add in a quantitative piece, you're looking at like literally 30, 35. Nobody wants to read that. They just
No.
don't. So
And it's just too much to keep track of and to follow and to do well. So you end up having like either one that's good and the other one is crummy, or like 2 mediocre bits or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, so mixed methods is already like a little bit worrisome. But again, important questions to ask. And so I did really appreciate about the paper that we're talking about here, the gender discrimination, is that they're asking about like, you know, how, you know, what have you experienced, and asking the questions about, you know, how, if at all, is the, you know, concern about gender discrimination affecting your career aspirations. So I conceptually, I really like that they're asking these questions. I think this is good. You know, I'll say I was surprised by some of the lack of some results, I guess. Is I don't know, I'm not explaining that very well, but I was like, huh, that's it? That's all you got? So I was a little bit surprised. Maybe it's a UK thing. I don't think so though. So what, you know, we'll just kind of go through what they did in the study. So, you know, they said mixed method study was designed to allow for triangulation of more generalizable quantitative data, and then richer qualitative data in the second phase, given the complexity of the topic. So that's kind of was their justification for going with mixed methods. So they, you know, started off with survey data. So they surveyed, I'm trying to remember now the numbers of their, like how many
It was a
were-
lot. It was like 700 because it was year 1 through 5. So they asked all of them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it was great as far as that was concerned. As far as you know, the quantitative data, there was lots and lots of data points, which was good.
Oh, the qual they only had 8 though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but for the quantitative part, lots of surveys, and a pretty good response rate actually.
262, 28% response rate.
Oh, okay. No, never mind. I was thinking it was better. Oh,
I mean, that's not
It's not terrible. It's
Yeah.
not terrible. That's an interesting thing to talk about too, is just response rate. Oh, that's like, yeah, that's like the hardest thing in survey research. And it's not just getting a high response rate, but ensuring that you're getting a representative response, right? Like that is so hard to do. And I think something it's worth talking about is,
I mean, I think it's literally impossible, right? Unless like forget consent, you know, like you're answering this, like you know, as long as we have informed consent, you can't get a representative sample.
no, but I do think there are techniques to try to get a more representative sample, or at the very least collect enough information to be able to say, you know, who did I sample, and therefore what information can I glean from this? Because you know, I think we often thinking about like who's going to respond to teacher evaluations, the people who loved the course and the people who hated the course, right? Like we all kind of, I think, instinctually understand that the people who have strong feelings about it who answers, but like that majority in the middle, we might not be getting a representation from. And so there are techniques that, survey researchers can do to try to target, to make sure I've gotten at least some people from these different groups. And again, none of them are perfect. I think, like you said, Eric, like it's not going to be perfect unless you get 100% response rate from your target population. But you're right, 28% is not a terrible response, but the question is, who was that 28%? And that's okay, but let's just acknowledge who that was and what the limitations might be. But it still ended up being 262 responses, which for, some 600-700, potential is not terrible. A couple of things that I do just want to point out that I found sort of striking. So if you look at figure 1, where they put these two questions together, which is asking the respondents, is gender discrimination is present within the veterinary profession? Do you strongly agree, no opinion, or strongly disagree with agree and disagree in there as anchors as well? And then along with that is, I am concerned about gender discrimination within the veterinary profession. And I don't know about Jill's reaction, but we had, what was it, like almost probably over 70%, 75% either strongly agreed or agreed that gender discrimination is present, but like less than 50% agreed that they were concerned about it. And I'm just like, what? I found that to be like probably the most fascinating part of this whole article. What were your thoughts on that?
So yeah, I think that's really interesting. But one of the things that I wondered about was, and I made a notation of this in their information when they talked about, where was it? Page 3. It said, of the students identifying as an underrepresented ethnic minority, 57% reported experiencing gender discrimination compared to 34% of all respondents. Yep. And so I wondered, how did they tease out that was gender discrimination versus racial or ethnic discrimination? Mm-hmm. And then I wondered, if you look back then at that figure that you were talking about, Bobby, is it, again, it sort of is like, what is the demographic of the population that responded, right? And so if you look at it, it was they don't report the ethnic or minority, I guess, response rate, other than they do talk a little bit about the LGBTQIA. But I wondered if maybe that was representative of a mixed sort of a muddling in the respondents. Yeah.
There's definitely some messiness with intersectionality in this, right?
Yeah.
And they touched on it a little bit, like you said, with gender expression and sexuality, but and very little when it came to other forms of intersectionality, looking at like race, religion, ethnicity. But like, I'm just fascinated, and I don't know how much of this is the way the questions are worded and someone's interpretation, but you're like, yes, there is gender discrimination. No, I am not concerned about that. And I'm like,
well, I wonder if that's because many of them haven't ever experienced it overtly, but I mean, it says that there were a number of people who had reported that they experienced it, but it's a little bit strange.
But that's why I'm wondering, is that like, and I'm trying to think about this, if I were going to ask the same question, is maybe it's how somebody's interpreting, I am concerned about gender. Were they thinking about it like, I'm not concerned because I'm fine personally. But like when I read that question, I'm like, you said there's gender discrimination, but you don't care. Like that's how I interpreted that. But that might not have been how it was presented in the survey, and they might have interpreted that. And so like, it's one of the pitfalls of survey research in general, right? Like you mean one thing, and then you get your results and you're like, oh, I'm pretty sure people were misinterpreting, like they were not answering that in the way that I thought they were. Yeah, there are people who are just like, yeah, gender discrimination is not actually a problem. Like, I don't know.
Well, they might not be concerned. Like, what rises the level of concern?
Yeah,
it's like, how severe does that need to be? Like, I can imagine looking at that and be like, maybe people are like, yeah, this happens, but it's not a problem.
Yeah,
know.
But that's one of those things where if they had done a really good job on the qualitative portion, they would have used that information to inform and asked follow-up questions about that, right? Like, oh, well, we noticed that almost 75 to 80% of you said that you recognize gender discrimination occurs, but really only about 50% of you are concerned about it. Can you help me understand that, right? I mean, and then they only had 8 people out of the 261 respondents. And so it makes it hard, but that would have been where like a mixed methods or a mixed survey would have been really helpful, or sending out a follow-up survey or something like that, because that's where that idea of trying to smush it all into one really kind of highlights the shortcomings of that.
No, I think that's a really good point, because I would say I didn't feel like the qualitative kind of focus group conversations with the 8 students stemmed from
it didn't support. Yeah.
And
they said that
wasn't.
it did, like methodologically, they were like, the questions that we asked were informed by the quantitative results, but I didn't, it felt like it was 2 different things.
Yeah, I didn't follow that thread. And because I would have homed in on some of these things where I was like, whoa, what's happening here? And so I worried a little bit that they had their own preconceived notions about what they were going to find. And then that's
confirmation bias. They were looking for confirmation bias with the qualitative data, and they found it, but they didn't really. So
can I just make a methodological note that is driving me mad? And so I have to tell you. So in the survey, instead of using radio buttons for single option answers, they're using checklists, and they give an instruction, please select no more than one answer. So now, just like from a survey construction standpoint, now you're adding an additive cognitive burden on the respondent to be like, oh, I can only choose one of these, even though as checkboxes, I can choose more. And later questions, they have radio buttons. So I know whatever technology they were using, they could have had all of this be radio buttons rather than instructing people to only choose one, which is bonkers. So I know it's just a little thing, but I'm just reading this survey right now. I'm like, oh my gosh, what the heck?
Really important. So last semester was when I took my survey and questionnaire design course for my master's. And like, we spent a lot of time, again, people throw together a survey and they put it out there, and it's like, no, like you need, that needs to go through like a number of layers of trying it out, of sending it to different people to make sure that they're understanding it, to make sure that the technology is working the way you want it to. And even when you do that multiple times, there's still going to be things that are wrong with it later. But like, that's the process that you have to go through. You need to, test it on the, somebody who is similar to the audience you're planning to send it to for clarity, and I've done this with both of you at various times, like, hey, can you tell me if this survey makes sense? What do you think this means? And then again, testing out the technology to make sure like little things like that are not adding to it, because now all of your results for that are potentially, suspect, because you're like, were they just confused about the instructions? Even there's a couple other things in here, was the way that the questions were worded positively or negatively can make it really confusing. Gender has not limited my opportunities is like potentially a confusing way. So, the better way of doing it is writing everything so it's the same for the respondents. And then in analysis later, you can flip flop it, right? Like you can say, I want all things that move in this direction or suggest gender discrimination. And you can just do that with the data because it's a 5-point scale and you flip flop it, right? It's not that hard to do in kind of post hoc analysis. But when you want to make sure that they're answering the question the way that they're not getting confused.
Right. And you want the questions to be consistent in format as much as possible, right? So you don't want to switch back and forth between a Likert scale and then a, sliding scale and then a yes, no. And like, you want them to be as consistent. So that's, I'm not an expert in survey design, but when people send me surveys, I'm like, listen, if you're going to do it this way, you need to group questions that are similar in construction together. And then you need to figure out a way, because generally there's a way to word any question in a Likert type or Likert scale. And so, but yeah, I agree. It's kind of like multiple choice questions. Oh, it's easy to write multiple choice questions. No, it's not. Same thing with
it's easy to write multiple choice questions. It's hard to write.
It's hard to write good ones.
Same thing with the survey, right? It's easy to write a survey. It's hard to write a really good one. Yeah.
I think one piece of advice that I remember reading was like, it should be like a conversation. And so I'm like, okay, would you ever like phrase this sentence in a conversation? My gender has not limited my opportunities. Like,
has your gender not limited your opportunities?
Right. Like that's
No, exactly. So again, I think people want the scale to always match, but you're like, no, you
Right.
can fix that later, right?
Yep.
And you make a good point, Catherine. Not that every question has to follow the same format, but then you group them
Right.
together. You say, here are all the questions that are, on the, strongly agree to strongly disagree. And then I might have other ones that are, most often, never, frequently, what, but lump those together, and that makes sense. And then, make sure it's not too much. But I think the hardest thing is to write questions that are like, there's only one way for someone to understand what this means. Like that is, I think, the hardest part of writing, especially with complex topics like this. I think it's really hard to write a question that anybody is going to read this and they're going to interpret it in the same way and answer that the question you want them to answer. But it takes a lot of work to try to tease that out in advance. It really does. And if not, it's like anything, right? Like if the instrument is not any good, if the test that I use isn't reliable, then I don't trust the results. And so you have to be a little bit skeptical of the results. And again, no survey is perfect. Nobody perfects it. But like it does take a lot of work in advance, not just asking the questions, but to try to really tease some of this out.
I do have one more, sorry,
Well,
one more technological note, which is super interesting comparing UK versus US. The way that we ask about race and ethnicity is very different. So, like applying for UK and Australian jobs, and like, I don't know, like, am I white British? Like, am I white Irish? I don't know. Am I white any other? I'm just like Caucasian, like that's what our option is in the US. And so, yeah, it's super interesting looking at like how they ask that question.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Although I would say that that's probably a lot more accurate in terms of being able to actually express your
Yes. Yeah, the
like,
level of detail is greater.
heritage,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
and because I wonder about, I'm like, well, if I go to Australia, do people call themselves Korean Australian or Asian Australian or Australian Asian or like, because
Right.
I don't think they do. I
I
mean,
don't
to
know.
be honest with you, I don't think that they do. And so there may be some that do, but yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. I think that's very interesting.
That's a different podcast. Okay, one thing I want to give them a shout out for in this paper, they included a reflexivity statement. So I want to give them some kudos for that, because you don't see that a lot, even in qualitative studies. And so, basically this is saying, hey, here are my biases. And this is kind of where I'm coming from. Again, we can discuss whether we think the reflexivity statement was what we wanted to be, or I'm sure we could critique it, but the fact that it was included, I think, was really, really good and really important. And it's nice to see that, because we don't always see this in veterinary, even qualitative studies. So
I don't know why they only did the one though, because at least two people did the analysis.
Yeah, that was one of my things. It was like they only gave it for the principal investigator, and then they said two authors first analyzed the data before a positive. So it would have been great to get that reflexivity statement from all the authors, honestly.
Yeah.
I will say, I think that the European qualitative researchers tend to do a little bit better job with those types of things than the American qualitative researchers, in my experience, reading papers and talking with people. I think in general, qualitative research from Europe and Australia tends to be better than that in the United States.
But I think it's an important thing to point out, because I think a lot of people don't know, like if you haven't learned about it, you're like, I don't even know what is this and what is that even there for? So I give them kudos for including that. I think that was really good. Results. With the caveat that we think there were some flaws in the methods, and we want to be careful what we take from this. But thoughts on the results, the main takeaways, beyond we've already talked about some of the survey questions, but what about results from the qualitative part of the study?
So they have this summary statement at the end. It's the second to last paragraph, and I highlighted the sentence that this discrimination impacted on students' career aspirations and may contribute to recruitment and retention challenges in the profession. And I basically said, but did it really?
Yeah.
Because I didn't feel like I think back to Eric's point, had enough information to come to that conclusion the way that they wrote it there, personally. I think they had information that if they had continued to investigate and dig a little bit deeper, they could have potentially gotten there. But based on what they provided in this particular paper, I didn't feel like that was an accurate interpretation of the results that they had gotten.
Yeah. I think the line that struck me was oh, can you boys go lift the sawdust stacks and then you girls go and feed the calves or something? And I was just like, that is a remarkable concept to me because, like in anesthesia, we got to get the animal up onto the gurney at the very least, right? And I am a big guy. I am more than happy to help, but I will not presume to do so. Like I'll see like, there's some like small people. It doesn't need to be small women, like small people trying to manhandle this Great Dane. And I'm like, I'll like if they ask for help, I'll help. But otherwise, like they got it. Like you're gonna have to manhandle Great Danes in your life. Like, like I don't
Or
it's
woman handle
remarkable
them.
to me, yeah, to think like, oh yeah, we'll put the guys on the strength-based stuff and the women will take care of the calves. Like that was wild.
Which is actually refreshing for me to hear, Eric, because I was actually in clinics in October, and one of the young women who was a technician had a large dog coming in, and she was like, dang, I can't believe we don't have any dudes here to help us out lifting this dog. And I just looked at her and I said, why do you need dudes? And she was like, well, and I'm like, no, we got this. We can do this, right? Like it may take four of us, but there's four of us here who are more than willing to help. And so I think it is really ingrained in a lot of society that that's what you say and do. And it may just be more overt in situations like that, but I see that in the clinic every day. I don't know about you, Bobby, but I do. I
Oh
see it in
yeah.
the clinic every day.
It's still pretty common. Um, it's funny because like I come at it from a very different perspective. Like I have a history of back issues, and so I'm like, none of you should be lifting that by yourself. What are you doing? We have lift tables for this sort of thing. And I like this. I was an athlete for years, and I was like, I can do anything on my own. I got something to prove here, and now I'm like, no, you will save your backs. Everybody will like, we will all group together, everybody together. We're going to coordinate, and like, I don't care who you are because if you hurt your back, it will affect you forever. So that's my bias.
Yeah.
And it's not gender based, it is experience based. But like I'll yell at people for lifting things. I don't care who you are, for doing something by themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nope, that's
I think
not like
that
I'm like
I
a person.
Yeah, I think I need to like credit my wife for this because she's tiny
Mhm.
and but she has this arrogant independence. Like she's like, I'm gonna do it. And
Mhm.
so I'm like, I just throw testosterone at the problem, and she like sits back and thinks, and her solution is 9 times out of 10 better than mine. And I'm like, yeah, throwing testosterone at the problem is rarely a good
Yeah.
solution.
No, we have tools for this sort of thing. We should totally
Yes.
use them.
Yeah, we're
Yeah,
tool
I'm a
using
big
mammals, we invented
yes.
the hammer for a reason.
Exactly. So I'm a big fan of being like, no, we have a lift table for this. Let's do this. Or we have straps that we can do that kind of thing. And but it is true. I think, Catherine, you're right that we do still see that kind of those like kind of, I guess they'd be like microaggressions, those microsexisms,
Yeah.
where nobody's meaning anything, nobody's trying to be, but it perpetuates some of those myths. And I remember, there were some things that I related to just from this study, thinking about, I don't know that I necessarily thought they were sexist, but I was a small animal, vet student on my large animal ambulatory rotation. And like, I was super into everything. So I'm like, this is super fun. This is, and I'm not petite, but I don't know if I'm not huge. I don't know if that matters at all, but there were definitely a lot of, the farmers and folks who went out and they were like, oh yeah, you could totally do this. You should get into large animal, blah, blah, blah. And I always interpreted that more just because I was engaged and I was interested. And I know that a lot of small animal students like didn't necessarily. So I think some of it was they'd had, crummy experiences from students who were just like, man, I'm never going to do this. But yeah, there may have been a little bit of sexism. I think the smallest person in my veterinary graduating class went into large animal, into like food
Right.
animal medicine. I think she was maybe like just barely 5 foot tall, tiny little thing. And she was like, yep, she was just wrangling everything, grew up around everything, nothing, she was short. She might need help to get something off that tall shelf, but that's what step stools are for. Like nothing held her
Yeah.
back. But I do think there is some, preconceived notions in that. But there's also things that I was hoping they would have gotten into in this about like motherhood and
Yeah.
the impact of becoming a parent, which again, in our society still impacts women more than men. Like that's just the women tend to be primary caretakers. And so I was surprised that didn't come up in any of their survey questions, that they didn't ask about this, and that in the qualitative data that they didn't ask about, like, what about going on to do advanced training after schooling, and because that's definitely something I've heard, anecdotally from people over the years, myself included, like, oh yeah, you can't have kids while you're doing X, Y, and Z.
I wonder if it's because they're younger in the UK, because they enter at 18 and it's a 5-year program, so they're done at 23. So maybe.
Good point.
Yeah, that might be part of it. I mean, yeah, I do think that's an interesting comment too. I mean, pregnancy is always going to affect women because men can't be pregnant, right? And whatever the hormones do to your body, they do to your body. But I do think that is another area of gender discrimination that is really interesting because it's so double-edged, and probably one of those things that we could explore for hours and hours, as Eric has alluded to already. But I mean, I distinctly remember in my first job, there were 2 men who were veterinarians, one of whom was the owner. And at one point, probably 4 or 5 months in to my very first job, this is one of the reasons that I was planning to leave, even though he fired me first, where he was walking around going, God, all these women, I wish I could figure out how to keep them from getting pregnant. And he's like openly saying this in a clinic that's 98% women, and he has his own children, and his wife has stayed home to raise the children, which is fantastic, right? Like that was her choice. That was what they decided to do. He was making plenty of money. That was the choice that they made. But, one of the things about feminism, at least in my mind, is it's not that you don't have to, that you have to get out and work and that you can't stay home and have kids and raise the children. It's that you have the option of doing what it is you want to do, right? If you want to stay home and be a mother and be a stay-at-home mom, that is as much feminist as choosing not to have children and going out to work, because that's the decision that you've made. It's not the one that's been made for you based on societal expectations. And so, yeah, I think it is really interesting. And that's a good point, Eric. But even then, I mean, people are, they're still adults. They're still sexually active, probably some of them. And some of them are potentially thinking about children. I mean, I had a young woman in my class who was 20 when she entered vet school. And so she was 24 when she graduated. And literally all she wanted to do was have babies. Like, she was super, super smart. All she wanted to do was get married and have babies. And I saw her probably 5 years after we graduated, and she was like 9 months pregnant. And I am telling you, she was like that woman that like glows when she's pregnant. I never knew what it was until I saw her. And I was like, oh my God, there are really people out there who just think pregnancy is like the best thing in the world. And that's you, right? So I mean, it's definitely
we should be having kids. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Like she should have all of the children because she clearly is enjoying the process and loves it and can afford to have the babies and is smart and all those things. So yeah.
No, I 100% agree with you, Catherine, that like to like real, like, if I'm going to be a feminist, I have to support men and women, right, in their choice to start having children whenever they choose to, whenever that works best for them, whether that's at 22 or whether that's at 32, whether that's in the middle of vet school, whether that's in the middle of internship, residency, afterwards, it doesn't matter, because it's none of my business when you choose to start to have children. But that's not how we talk about it in our profession, right? And we don't necessarily create an environment that is supportive. So again, as somebody who has chosen not to have children, but who considers myself, a feminist, I will fight for your right to have kids whenever it works for you, and to have the support to do that. And that the burden to, help with that should not fall on me. It should not fall on you. It shouldn't fall on anyone else. That's the business, right? It should be taking that on there. That's one of the problems that I think we have in the profession, is that we set things up and we're like, oh,
but that might be different with the UK.
Yeah.
Since the survey was UK, like they have mandatory paid leave. So there's all these short-term postings, like we need someone for 6 months and whatnot. So like you're not impacting your colleagues, whereas in the US, you are, like there's not a mechanism that we have for this.
Which is a little bit crazy.
There's not a mechanism to be used for this.
Right. Well, the thing is
that
in the United States, you're rewarded for having children in many, many ways, right? But you are not rewarded for not having children. And so, and in fact, in some ways, you're actually penalized for not having children. And so it's a very different approach to to motherhood and fatherhood and all those kinds. And just because I'm being nosy, Eric, do you have kids?
No.
I think it's, well, I didn't think so. So I think it's
Yeah.
very interesting that the three of us
Yeah.
have like chosen not to have children. And it might be interesting to do a topic.
Oh, yeah, we could do an episode about that. Yeah.
And we
you know,
need to have a
why-
guest on, somebody who has had kids.
Oh, there
Yeah.
you go.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Because-
talk to somebody about it in that regard, and yeah, some of the
Yeah.
you know,
So,
struggles that they may have faced or not.
Yeah. absolutely.
But that's
So-
it's a really fair point though, Eric, that could be part of why this was a big difference. Although I don't know, the cynic in me is kind of like, really, that like they've reached complete gender parity when it comes to parenthood.
Well, no, there's not.
Yeah. But I think you're right. The combining like the younger age of the students, and you know, some of the you know, government-based programs that are in place and a little bit better, more ubiquitous than what we have in the US may have tempered that a little bit. So fair point. Yeah, fair point. Other things, yeah.
What
Yeah,
about
that was-
the reporting piece of the results?
Yeah.
Which
I
one?
thought that was interesting. And again, I wish that they had asked the question in such a way like, you know, do you report those, you know, microsexisms, you know, like, and I don't know. I'm just thinking like, talking to an old farmer and they're saying some crazy racist, sexist nonsense. And I'm like, what are you going to do about that guy? You know, like I'm not saying that it's okay. And especially if you're a educator, right? If you're supervising these students, you need to do better. Yeah. So I don't know. I feel sometimes a little bit hopeless about helping those people.
Yeah, so I actually have a colleague right now who's out of vet school that has demonstrated chronic racism against this individual. I mean, and it's pretty blatant to the point where this person has had conversations. It's a woman. She's had conversations with numbers of lawyers, numbers of people on campus in the HR department, and all of them have advised her to file a complaint because like they are like, yeah, you literally have
A good case, yeah.
racism documented on multiple occasions from multiple people. You have documentation that they are retaliating against you when they believe that you are potentially talking to people. Like she has a really, really strong case to go up against these people. And she's concerned that it's going to potentially impact her ability to get promoted and all of the things, right? And she has decided not to move forward with any kind of complaint because she has had conversations with other individuals who were in similar situations and it never went well for them. And so I think that it is really, really difficult because I've certainly experienced situations where it should have been reported and it should have been something. But what has happened, at least in the United States, and this may not be the case in the UK, I don't know, but in the United States, in my opinion, and what I've experienced is that institutions are not built to protect individuals, they're built to protect the institution. And so if you're doing or saying something that threatens them in that way, or was going to put them in a light that is not very nice, then they're going to do everything they can to just get you out of there.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
there's this institutional systemic oppression of people who are constantly exposed to this that basically teaches you, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it is racial discrimination, whether it's discrimination based on a disability, like any of those things, you just don't speak up. You just put your head down, you get through it, and you get out because you have no power in the situation. And so it is really hard because when you're out on farm calls or you're in a clinic and you hear something, right? Like you want to do or say something, but then you also have to think, okay, am I now putting a target on my back? What are people going to do or say about me? How are they going to, retaliate in those small ways against me? And as a white man who is a very tall and somewhat, good looking guy, Eric, you have pretty much all of the advantages. And so less concern about that. But somebody like me who is racially diverse and is a smaller statured woman, I've certainly experienced situations that I know other people wouldn't have experienced. And I'm sure, Bobby, you have similar stories. So
well, and I feel like I was complicit for a long time, right? Like,
yeah,
because
I mean, it's hard.
Somebody makes a joke. So you were talking about how do I prevent all these women from getting pregnant? When I I joined a team that had mostly men, actually, in my small little team, and I was one of the only women. And they made jokes about like putting prostaglandins in my drinks to keep me from getting, and I laughed along with it, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you don't want to be the person who's like, oh God, you're anti-fun. You don't want us to make
Yeah.
jokes. This is just
Your
a joke.
skin's
We're
too
obviously
thin. You just need to suck it
Mhm.
up. It's just a
And so
joke.
I did. I kind of went along with it. And I personally, right, this is where the whole like I'm not concerned by it, right? Like that
Yeah.
was kind of me for a while because like I'm okay. I'm doing okay. I wasn't actually worried like one that they were actually going to put prostaglandins in my, but I was like I also didn't want children at the time, and so that wasn't an issue, but later and I'd been around for a bit longer. Same group of people had gotten a little bit bigger, but we had others in the group, some residents and things like that, women who were at the age where they did want to start having kids. And I realized like I'm in a position, I have a little bit more power now, right? And I did start speaking up about those kinds of things, and it wasn't very fun, right? Now it's like, yeah, you're not the fun one anymore. You don't, like you calling people out for making comments like, oh, maybe we just shouldn't have women residents anymore. And I was like, okay, that like, we can't, this isn't okay. Like, and I kind of went off, and then it was like a whole big thing. And then I wasn't part of the jokes anymore. Like, I feel like it just was like, okay, well, we just won't say those things around Bobby. I'm pretty sure those jokes were still being
Although
made. They just
I
were
don't
being
know. I am kind of okay being that buzzkill. Like everyone knows when
yeah.
Hoff is on the floor, we don't have music going on. We don't have gossip and chit chat. Like we are here to do a job, and we do that job and we go home. And like I don't know what you're talking about in the tech office, but like I can't affect that,
Yeah.
But when
But there's a
you're
privilege
interacting with
in
the
that though,
students
Eric.
around me, like we're doing a job.
Absolutely. But there's a privilege in that. I had gotten to the point in my career where I felt like that was a cost that was okay to pay. I was
Yeah.
okay at that point. But early on, 6 years before, I hadn't established that yet. I didn't feel like that was I don't know. I'm like, I'm barely brand new clinical assistant professor. I hardly know anybody. Like I'm trying to make friends. I'm trying to establish myself in my career. And like there is a cost. There's a cost. And when by the time I got to the point where I paid it, it was well worth paying it. Like I'm glad
Yeah.
at that point. But earlier on, I wasn't ready for that. And I probably, could have and should have been. Maybe that would have made some differences. And I have to deal with that. I have to live with that. But there is a real cost to being that person and to say, like, I'm comfortable with this. And not everyone is. And that's okay. That not everyone is personally comfortable with that or secure in their professional situation that they can be that because yeah, like, the story Catherine's telling, this person's like, you know what? It's not worth losing my job over this or being miserable in every other aspect of it. And you
Yeah.
get to a point where you're just like, yeah, this is just how
Well,
people are and I deal with it. And that's not
and
okay, but we deal with it.
yeah, well, and this person happens to be a very small in stature, fairly petite woman who's already in an area of veterinary medicine where she's a significant minority. She also happens to be an ethnic minority. And so there's sort of all these things going along. But I mean, I can appreciate what you say, Eric, but again, there's a level of privilege that you have that I will never have and that Bobby will never have. And I think that you recognize that. I feel comfortable that you recognize that. But there are a lot of people out there who don't recognize that and they don't wield it in a way that is appropriate or that could actually swing the pendulum in the direction it needs to go. And even you as the only woman, right, Bobby, even if you had been in a more senior position at that point as the only woman, it still may not have been worth it because, there are extroverts and there are introverts, but we are essentially pack animals as humans and we want to belong. We want to have a group. We want to have a pack or a family to which we feel comfortable. And where do we spend most of our time? It's at work. And so if we don't fit in at work, then we feel very isolated no matter, where we come from. And so I think the whole microaggression thing is a really difficult thing because you want to be able to use your powers for good, but then sometimes you feel like, is it really worth it? Or does it really move the needle in any meaningful way?
Yeah,
but,
and it's not coincidence that I left that position not too long after
right?
you know what I mean?
Well, and as educators, we absolutely have this I feel like we have this obligation not to protect our students in a way that they're so insulated that they don't know how to handle it, but to protect our students in a way that they understand they have allies, right? That they understand that there are certain behaviors that are just not acceptable and that you can speak up and still be okay with that and still move forward and be successful in your career. You know, a lot of our Black students, particularly our Black female students, they want to go into large animal medicine, and then they go out on their first call and they have horrible experiences and they don't have somebody there to stand up for them. And so they leave. Now, if they had somebody there who would be an advocate and an ally for them, whether preferably their, you know, their clinician or some other sort of authority figure, or even if it's just another student, at least they're going to feel a little bit like, okay, I can make a go of this. But if you don't have that, and you don't just have that sort of bulldog mentality, then that's why we lose so many women and particularly women of color in large animal medicine. And we need them desperately, you know, we need them everywhere, but we need them in large animal medicine. So
A complication that occurs to me about this is like some cultural differences. So like I've had some fellow faculty who are British, and their sense of humor is more risque than we are in America. And you know, they'll say what I consider to be an off-color joke, and you know, I think people laugh. I don't know how genuine it is and how much it's due to that power differential, but they are well liked professors, you know? And so like I'm sitting here seeing this, I'm like, I don't think that's appropriate. Do I need to say something about that to them? But from their point of view, this is a successful social strategy, right?
Yeah.
And a successful
We've maybe
pedagogical
even toned it
strategy.
down for the Americans. Yeah. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
yeah,
And
be
so
careful going
like
to Australia if you think this is tough. Yeah.
but like I'll see, and not just culturally, but just like personal preference,
Yeah.
like I'll see like faculty interacting like more personally than I feel comfortable with. And I'm like, I don't know if that's okay, but everyone loves you, you know?
Yeah.
So like,
Or
well,
it
I mean,
seems
I
like
think,
everyone does.
yeah,
well,
that's part
exactly.
of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, the American sensibility is it's pretty Victorian in a lot of ways, right? But a lot of that has to do with the litigious nature of our society. I don't think that litigiousness necessarily extends to a lot of other countries. I mean, we had a large animal professor at Texas A&M who was he was extremely touchy-feely, just with men, with women, with everybody. But it made a lot of people uncomfortable, and nobody knew how to say something to him. And at some point, it eventually got to the point where it was like, dude, you're going to lose your job if you keep doing that. And one of his supervisors had to say, you cannot do that. And he's like, and again, everybody loved him. Everybody thought he was a great guy, but there was this level that he went beyond, and because that power differential, nobody was willing to say it. So it might
But
be
also,
that kind of situation.
yeah, in some ways that's sort of unfair to that person that people let it go for so long, right? That like he was led to believe for years that like, hey, people like this. This is great. And because they're afraid to say something. So obviously there's a self-awareness piece there. But like when you're not really doing anyone any favors by not speaking up with things like that are kind of, you know, the hard
But
part
if you're a
is
student, I mean, you don't know
not
how
the
they're going to
students.
react. You know, you don't. I mean, his colleagues let him down by not saying anything for years and years because
and that's who I mean. That's what I mean. I don't mean the students. I mean others, like I mean bosses, right? Who hear these things or say like, hey, we haven't gotten any complaints, but like I noticed this, and you need to be aware of this because this may not be okay. And you know, I work in ER where you know, when things are kind of crazy, the jokes can get kind of dark, we can get kind of cynical, and that's a protective mechanism. And you know, I don't know where y'all are on the swearing scale, but like definitely people are not always on their best behavior when it comes to swearing. And some people like aren't comfortable with that. They tend to not work in emergency, but if you're walking through, you know, and so you do try to be a little bit mindful. But also again, hey, this is how we do things here. If that's something you're not comfortable with, like you speak up, right? Remind people aren't doing this to make you uncomfortable. This is kind of how we offload some of the stress and things. And I think most students get that. But I guarantee there's some that come through and they're like, oh, I'm not comfortable with this. And so where do you draw that line between saying, hey, okay, this is how people do things. It doesn't have to be how I do things. I know it's not directed at me, and so I'm okay with it. And at what point you're like, no, you shouldn't be rubbing my shoulders. Like, you know, you know, some of those are very obvious lines, I think, for most of us, but it's not always clear, you know, what to do.
And I think that's the thing, you know, that line might be slightly different, but I think for different individuals, but I also think it reminds me of one of my colleagues when I was in practice, who I may have told the story before, but she's a very attractive woman, married, very nice woman. came out and had this odd look on her face. And I was like, you know, what's going on? And she's like, I think I might have just been sexually harassed. And just that statement, right? The fact that she had to question whether or not her being uncomfortable with a client was okay, I think is
me or
a
is that
lot,
them?
right?
Yeah.
And I was like, well, what do you mean you think you've been sexually harassed? She's like, well, you know, she describes how she went in and it's like a medium-sized dog, maybe a 30 or 40-pound dog. And she asked the male client to put the dog on the table. So he put the dog on the table and the dog rolled over. She was scratching the dog's belly. And the guy looks at her and is like, oh yeah, she likes it when I scratch her titties that way too. And she's like, it just didn't feel right. I was like, because it wasn't. I was like, you were 100% sexually harassed. And she's like, so I just don't feel comfortable going back in there. I'm like, don't. I said, go get Dr. Nigliasa, who happens to be a male veterinarian, and you send him in there and you don't have to go back in. But the fact that she questioned that and that she felt like she maybe should have been obligated to go back into a situation where she was clearly uncomfortable, I think says a lot about society and the expectations of what we're supposed to manage. And not to say that doesn't happen to men, because it does, but I think it does happen a lot more often to women.
Yeah.
And so I think it is okay
It's
to
that questioning though that leads to
Right.
the lack of reporting, and also
Right, exactly.
where some people in here are like, is that really even sexual discrimination?
Is that a big deal? Like, should I
We're just
feel
making a joke.
uncomfortable?
This is
Am I just being
people
too sensitive? You know,
Yeah.
all those things. And
you
so,
do.
yeah, so again, I don't know. I do think that is more prominent in large animal medicine, especially when you're on those farm calls and things like that, because it's just a different thing. But I know a lot of women who were raised on farms, and I know a lot of women who are interested in large animal medicine. And I don't know, I don't spend time with them on the farm. And so I don't know if they engage in similar behaviors or if they're complicit in those behaviors. Like I don't know that part. But I can certainly see how that would impact someone's desire to go into certain areas of medicine. And I would have liked to see that explored, to get back to the paper, a little bit more in the paper, right? Like, because they were, you know, the perception is that, you know, small animal medicine is more for women and large animal medicine is more for men, which may be true, but did it actually influence, you know, like, was there gender discrimination that actually influenced those decisions? And I feel like they could have explored that a little bit more deeply and given us, a better true picture of how that really did affect it, or if it really did affect them in that way.
Yeah.
And it would be an interesting longitudinal study too, right? To see if,
definitely.
you know,
Follow them over time. Yeah.
The other question I have go ahead, Eric.
Well, I was just going to say something you mentioned about, like, this is the social norm that we have in this setting, like ER, you know, that you're modeling that behavior, you know, it's like, these are the norms that we have here. And if you're modeling behavior that is sexist, then the students are going to pick up and be like, okay, this is how we do this thing, you know. And if you're modeling behavior that is, I won't even say not sexist, because never can't be, but like less sexist, then it's like, oh, okay, that is not what we do here, you know, like that. There's all the hidden curriculum stuff, right? The students are just constantly like looking at their role models and processing and being like, oh, this is what's okay, this is what's not okay. And like, we have that responsibility.
Absolutely. No, I think that's, again, in this paper, they talk about, you know, discrete acts of discrimination, sexual discrimination. But what I'm more interested in are those subtle underlying structural things that are in place. And this is, we can again talk about this in the other session that Eric has promised me, where we could talk about this more broadly. But we talk about the feminization of the profession. And when people say that, what they mean is there are now more women in the profession than men. But the profession itself maybe hasn't been feminized, right? In the sense that,
I mean, like they say in the leadership roles, you know, like that's bonkers.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. And those are some of the papers that we can look at as well. But where I'm trying to get at, like with my like little mini dissertation for this course, which is not a mini dissertation, just kind of an idea, but is really what we need to get away from is, this is men or women or even masculine or feminine, but like, these are just traits that different people have that are sometimes beneficial in these circumstances and are other times, you know, beneficial in those circumstances. And that we should just kind of start appreciating like diverse traits, diverse perspectives, diverse personalities, because men get harmed by these gender stereotypes as well, right? Like if you're seen as, caring and empathetic, and like you might be branded as weak, or different things like that. Like men aren't allowed to show emotion, and that harms men, right? Men aren't allowed to express it. So all of these things are harmful when we say, hey, men are supposed to behave like this and to have these traits, and women are supposed to behave like this and have these traits, and we value these things differently. But rather than be like, hey, people are people, and these are traits that can be, being really like logical and unemotional is really helpful in certain circumstances. When you're in the middle of surgery and things are going wrong, like now is the time to be logical and unemotional, and that's a helpful trait. But like when you're consoling a client who just found out that they lost their beloved pet, now's not the time to be rigid and unfeeling and aloof. Like we need to be able to turn these traits on and off, and we're all going to have strengths and weaknesses there, but let's value these different traits for what they are, not for who has them. And that's where I think we've not done a very good job, not just in veterinary medicine, in society at large, but I think as a microcosm, veterinary medicine could do better.
Yeah, and I will say there's actually research that refutes what you just said, Bobby. There's actually research out there, particularly in professors, that demonstrates that men who step outside of their stereotypes are perceived more positively. Women who step outside of their stereotypes are actually penalized for it. So women have the double penalty, the double penalty. Now,
if you're talking about professors, yes, there are some areas where that's not true. Yes. So that's a little bit more mixed. And there are some, most of the time women who take on traditionally masculine behaviors are harmed comparatively. So yes, we've talked about a lot of this in my gender course. And so it is a lot more of a mixed bag for men. But there are still some social costs for,
oh, certainly. Yeah.
So depending on the circumstance, as a professor, you're maybe okay. But in other areas, it's not okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And and that's not to say that that's true all the time, but there are instances where there's a double whammy.
No, that's a fair point.
It's actually really good.
It's not across the board. That's absolutely true. But in veterinary medicine, again, we could do better.
Yeah, I think there are lots of things that we could do better.
Yeah,
that's true.
What I always think of when I read a paper is like, how is this going to change your clinical practice? And I think one takeaway that it makes me being more intentional about, because of the barriers to reporting, that we need to be more proactive about how to educate educators about this as a problem. And look, we need to talk about this. When you say things like this, just be aware that people are hearing it. And I think that making it more conscious awareness would help in that regards, because the reporting is, like we talked about, problematic.
Training for allies and bystanders, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah. Also
and I actually really like that statement, just kind of hearkening back to my psychology professor who was hardcore quantitative and became qualitative that we talked about at the beginning. She also happened to be a gay woman growing up in an era where that just was not an acceptable thing. But she was a super, super strong woman. And I remember we were sitting in class one day, and I can't remember what the conversation was, but she was basically telling us, sometimes you don't have to report anything. You just have to tell the person that's engaging in that behavior that you see it. So she told us one day about where she was at in the parking lot of a store, and some woman had just wailed on her kid, was literally just abusing this child physically in ways that should not have been appropriate, or that were not appropriate. And so, my professor just kind of sat there and watched this happen and thought about intervening, and was like, it's probably not the best thing for me to do that. Thought about all these things that she could have done. And in the end, she just walked up to the woman, it was a woman, and said to her, I saw what you did to your child. That is not okay. And walked off. And the woman just sort of had this immediately mortified look on her face and was, embarrassed and did all the right things. Now, who's to say she didn't take it out more on her child when she got home? Nobody knows. But it made my professor feel, A, as if she had done something, and B, she had made somebody aware that they were being watched, and that was in many ways just as important as reporting it. And so, I agree 100% that if we just make educators aware of what it is, and then even if we just pull them off to the side and say, listen, I saw X, Y, and Z, and I just want you to know that I saw that and I felt really uncomfortable. Maybe that's enough to start getting people to think about
No, I think that's really
Worth it.
powerful, right?
And what
Especially-
I love about that is the I statement, Catherine, where it's like I felt uncomfortable, and
Yeah.
so that person doesn't feel attacked. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, you know, it doesn't matter, right? Because you could say, okay, well, hey, you know, Eric, I saw you rubbing Catherine's shoulders the other day, and like that made me uncomfortable. You don't get to defend it and be like, no, Catherine was fine with it. I go,
Right.
it doesn't matter. You made
Doesn't
me
matter.
uncomfortable.
Exactly.
So yeah, again, I think that's where like that allyship and the bystander training, like how as a bystander, how as somebody who wants to try to intervene, but isn't always comfortable like jumping in and stopping it, right? Or maybe if it's after the fact, but maybe I don't want to make it a public thing for them or for me. So yeah, so training for things like that. How do we approach it in a non-threatening way without being like, you're a bad person, but just saying, hey, I noticed this and it's something you might want to think about because it made me kind of uncomfortable. And just get them thinking. Their initial reaction might be, ugh, whatever, blow it off. But then maybe a little bit later, right? And then a couple weeks later, somebody else says something. And now suddenly I have to pay attention because this is now a pattern. And, you know, maybe some people are sociopaths and we're not going to fix that. But for the people who care and want to be better, which I'd like to think is the vast majority of us, I think that can make a difference over time.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference. And I talk about this with a lot of people is like, I classify ignorance in two different ways. There's like intentional ignorance and then there's true ignorance. True ignorance you can address. Intentional ignorance, they're just always going to be that way because they don't care, right? But true ignorance you can address. And so those people who are just truly ignorant, like my professor in vet school who just truly did not know that he was making people uncomfortable, I think would have really benefited from those kinds of conversations offline. But yeah, there's going to be 10 or 15% of people that they don't care and they're just going to do whatever anyway. But hopefully
that doesn't have to change who I am and what I do. And I think that's, you know, when you get to that point, and again, when you get to a point of privilege, the people out there that are in positions of power and in positions of a little bit more authority, a little bit more security, we're the folks that really have to step up and kind of look out for those people who haven't yet achieved that degree of security where they feel comfortable speaking up. And if you're one of those people and you're speaking up anyway, good on you. I mean, I wish I could go back in time and do a better job. But you know, we all make progress and we all get better. And I think that's the other thing is giving somebody the respect to believe that they're willing to learn and change and that they can. Because if I stop trying, if I think you're a lost cause, right? Like that's not very good for you. But like if I'm giving you feedback, it's because I think, you know, I think you care enough that you want to hear it and you want to be better. So,
well, it's giving them a choice, right? It's not backing them into a corner and forcing their hand. It's just basically giving them a choice to maybe act differently around you or maybe think about it or whatever, but it gives them the option of kind of figuring out what they're going to do with that information. So I'm actually really excited about the next conversation we have.
Well, so thank you for the discussion on this paper, and you know, a thank you to Dr. Freestone and her colleagues for doing this again. We had our complaints, we had our issues, and no paper is without its flaws, but there's some really important work here, and I think asked some really good questions, stimulated some really good discussion amongst us, and so really want to give them a shout out and thanks for the work they did, and thank you both for a great discussion, and I look forward to a follow-up.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks.
All right. Have a good night, y'all.